Okay, we are. Hello, everybody.
Hi, folks.
I'm going to take the promo away now. Hope everybody's doing well. We are certainly doing well.
Can't complain.
And why would we anyway, right?
Oh, I wish I had that much grace, Joe.
When you live in a building where the people are all fairly old, and you ask them how they are,
Have a glass of wine.
the normal response is, I can't complain. Can't complain.
I'll be right back. I better grab something off the table. Hold on.
Okay. Well, folks, I can't complain either. There's Sandy. Hey, Sandy. We have to get together again and finish those memes that we've got. And Teresa, hello. How are you? It's nice to see you here.
What do you have to get together and finish?
Sandy and I started a bunch of memes.
Oh.
Basically, short statements of the fiscal myths.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got about 24 of them right now. And we've got to put the final touches on them and start to use them. You know, tweeting them out. You know, they're MMT fiscal myths. Not the fiscal myths of MMT, but the fiscal myths that MMT counters, of course.
I get it. And we certainly could use that right now because people's eyes are open and they're looking for answers. So it's time.
Yes. I think we'll have some answers tonight. Okay, if there's anything that you would like to comment on or that's not made completely clear in the slides, Lisa, please interrupt. And we'll talk about them. I want to go through this in a very deliberate way and see to it that everybody understands things. That there's nothing that's cloudy, or at least nothing that's absolutely crystal clear. So I'm going to start sharing. I have preloaded a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, I have a presentation I've been adding to over a very long period of time, and it's called MMT Back to Basics. Not very original, I know. So this particular slide set is excerpt number 2 from MMT Back to Basics. The next slide shows, okay, I've titled this episode Part 1, but it's really Part 2. Part 1 was the public purpose and goals of MMT-based policies that we did some time ago to start off this series, the MMT and public purpose series. Anyway, what we're going to cover tonight in what I've called Part 1, but is really Part 2. I introduced the confusion right at the beginning. We'll cover how Treasury spending happens and creates net financial assets in the economy. We'll also cover how net financial assets are drained out of the economy. And then we'll talk about sectoral financial balances. That sounds very, very complicated, but it's actually very simple, I think. I will try to clarify it for everybody. It's one of the things in MMT that seems to confuse people. I don't know why. And then the last thing we'll cover, if we get to it, and if we don't get to it, then we'll handle it sometime in the near future, uh, is a unit on the federal job guarantee, which is in many ways everybody's favorite MMT subject. So that's what I hope to cover tonight. And let me get to how Treasury spending happens. Let me go full screen on this one. Maybe make us a little smaller even. And go full screen here. So here's a very simple graphic. You notice at the top is Congress appropriates Treasury spending. Congress passes a money bill. Okay? And there's an arrow from there to the third box here, which says Treasury spends the reserves into the private sector, or actually the non-government sector, could be the foreign sector too, into the private sector, creating financial assets. Okay. Now, why doesn't that just happen continuously? Because Congress appropriating Treasury spending doesn't guarantee that the balance in the Treasury spending account, also called the Treasury General Account at the New York Fed, it doesn't guarantee that there will be enough reserves in that account to spend the full amount of money Congress has appropriated and mandated that the Treasury spend. That's why we have debt ceiling crises, because the balance in the Treasury account gets low and there's not enough money in it to spend the appropriations. So at that point, Treasury has to do something to get the Federal Reserve to add reserves to the Treasury spending account so it can spend an appropriation. And the second box you see there says the Federal Reserve creates the high-powered reserves needed for the Treasury spending account. What are high-powered reserves? Well, here I'll simply define them as reserves created by the Federal Reserve. Why are they high-powered? Because they are the most trusted reserves by people coming from any source. Why are they most trusted? Because in the hierarchy of money, they stand at the top. They are more trusted than our bank reserves. They are more trusted than money that the scripts that are sometimes issued by state governments, K as IOUs, when the state governments run into trouble. They are more trusted than private sector bonds. They stand at the top of the hierarchy, of money. And that's the sense in which they are high powered. And there is no other sense of that term that's important. So the Federal Reserve creates the new reserves, high-powered reserves that are needed for the Treasury spending account. And there's an arrow going from there to the next box, which says that the Treasury spends the reserves into the private sector, but creating financial assets. Now, in the box that is hidden by Lisa and I there, the blue box that is hidden says that the Treasury taxes, or the government taxes, assets away. Taxes net financial assets away. So the Treasury is adding net financial assets, and it's taxing net financial assets away. When the Treasury deficit spends, it leaves net financial assets in the non-government sector. Okay, because it's spending more money than it's taxing away. So the outcome of the processes on this slide is net financial assets, which is deficit spending. Now, for the federal government, deficit spending is the normal state of affairs. If you go back to the beginning of the Second World War, there are very few years in which the federal government has run a surplus. Just off the top of my head, I'd say the ratio of deficit spending years to surplus years is probably about 6-1 or 7-1 or something like that. It's just hugely more frequent that the federal government has a deficit, than it has a surplus. Now, people make a big fuss about this, and they try to terrorize us because we've got all this deficit spending going on. But what this chart is showing you, part of what it's showing you, is that when there's deficit spending, net financial assets are left in the non-government sector. Some of these assets are going to the foreign sector, but the heavy majority of those net financial assets are going to the domestic private sector. That means the government is putting money into the domestic private sector. It means some people are getting money from the government. Some corporations are getting money from the government. There are many of us who are getting money from the government. The government is putting money in our pockets. Now, from our personal point of view, that is a very good thing, of course. A lot better than the government taking out more than it is putting in. So, from the point of view of a currency user like ourselves, and corporations, and various institutions, deficit spending is a good thing for us. Now, of course, it's not a bad thing for the federal government either. Why? Because the Federal Reserve can create the high-powered reserves that are needed for the Treasury spending account. To the Federal Reserve has been delegated the power of Congress to create new money. So let's go to the next slide and go to some of the amplifications of that. So this is just a listing, of what was in the graphic. Congress appropriates federal spending Treasury spends the reserves into the non-government sector, creating financial assets. The Federal Reserve creates the high-powered reserves needed for the Treasury spending account. Some of these become net financial assets after taxation drains away some of the financial assets spent into the economy by the government, leaving a budget deficit. Okay. So I'm going to exit the full screen for just a moment, and I'm going to put us back on the side because I see that works better and will not block that final statement. So I will go again to the full screen, but here we are. So that's it, is the point. Notice there's no taxing or selling debt instruments, treasury bonds and securities. That's directly involved creating the reserves spent into the non-government sector. So you should note that. Keep that in mind. There's no taxing or selling debt instruments that's directly involved. All that's directly involved is Congress appropriating money, the Federal Reserve filling up the Treasury spending account from time to time. Okay, and the Treasury, I don't know what that is.
That was my son taking care of the garbage. Sorry, folks.
Okay, okay, and the Treasury spending the money into the non-government sector. So you might ask, where do taxes and bonds come in? So let's go to slide 4. Did you know that Congress appropriates taxes? Also, we tend to ignore that. We think of appropriations, okay, as only mandates to spend. But there are also mandates to tax. The appropriations process in Congress includes the exercise of the power to tax. And it delegates to Treasury the authority to create and sell debt instruments. So Treasury collects tax revenues. Treasury sells debt instruments and gets also revenues from the debt instruments that it sells. So what happens to these revenues? Why don't they get into the spending process? I just indicated in the last slide they don't get into the spending process. So why is that? At the state government level, they get into the spending process. The money goes into a bank. And when the state government wants to spend, it draws down its account at the bank. That's what happens at the state level. That's what happens to us at the personal level. That's what happens at the corporate level. But with the Federal Reserve, it's different. During the settlement of the deposits the Treasury makes at the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve marks down private sector accounts, draining reserves from the private sector. In other words, destroying those reserves. As it marks up the Treasury spending account with new money that is creating new high-powered federal reserves. What are they? New additions to the Treasury spending account. This is all done, of course, by keystroking on what amounts to a giant spreadsheet. Now, this critical aspect of the process, which, by the way, shows that the tax revenues that are collected and the bond revenues that are collected cannot possibly be what is spent, because the Federal Reserve destroys them in the process of settlement. This important process and this important finding was made by Stephanie Kelton in a classic paper she wrote in 1999. And the classic paper was called Can Taxes and Bond Sales Finance Federal Spending? And her conclusion was no, they cannot and they do not, because the Federal Reserve is destroying the money from the private sector accounts and then creating the new money for those accounts. So the best way to look at the taxing process, okay, and the bond process is that those deposits function as a trigger, basically ordering the Federal Reserve to create the new money that the Treasury needs for its spending account. That means we can ask the very important question here: are there other triggers that could cause the Federal Reserve to mark up the Treasury spending account? And the answer to that question is there are, but in this particular presentation, we're not going to go over some of these other triggers, but I will say to some of you who know my work that the two most important, potentially most important ones, if they were ever used by the federal government, would be essentially minting and depositing high-value platinum coins in the mints account. And the second trigger would be what I've called something known as overt congressional financing, okay, or OCF, which is particular language that could be put in appropriations bills that would mandate the Federal Reserve to mark up the Treasury spending account for the amount of an appropriation. I'm not going to go into that here. I will do that in future units. So, to go into the verbiage here, Congress appropriates taxes and delegates to Treasury the authority to create and sell debt instruments. Treasury collects tax revenues. It sells debt instruments to the non-government sector and collects the proceeds. It deposits the tax and bond sale proceeds at the Fed. During settlement, the Federal Reserve marks down the non-government sector accounts, draining reserves from that account, thus destroying the reserves as it marks up the Treasury spending account with new high-powered reserves. So, how can taxes or bond sales pay for federal spending? When tax and bond revenue is destroyed, a new high-powered money is created in the Treasury spending account before Treasury spends. Before Treasury spends. So what is Treasury spending? It is spending the new money. This is an important proposition from the MMT point of view. Okay, let's stop for a minute. Are there any questions about how net financial assets are created? Are there any questions about how they're drained out of the economy? I am going to check to see if I have any questions about that here. Okay. Do you have any questions, Lisa, up to this point?
Joe, I think it would be good for you to answer the question that you posed in your last bullet point.
Oh, okay. The answer is okay. If it's new money that is being put into the Treasury spending account by the Federal Reserve, then the money from the taxes or bond sales, which is destroyed by the Federal Reserve, cannot finance the federal spending. Cannot finance federal spending, does not finance federal spending. What finances federal spending is the Federal Reserve creating the new money in the Treasury spending account. That, coupled with the appropriations by Congress, is what finances federal spending. I should perhaps say here that most of the MMTers, when talking about this process, explaining it to the public, don't go into Stephanie's point from her 1999 paper. They gloss over that and they just say when Congress appropriates the money, the Treasury Department is going to spend it into the economy. So, from their point of view, or at least from the point of view of what they're explaining to people, it's Congress that is funding the spending, but Congress alone. And technically speaking, that's right, but it glosses over the process of the Federal Reserve in many instances having to add money to the Treasury spending account so the Treasury can spend an appropriation. In what I've just given you here, I do not gloss over that process. Okay, I explain it to you. It
I
throws
think I think it's really important for people to understand that Treasury settlement process because it it takes some of the ambiguity out of the equation. Because it's really hard after generations and generations of gold standard hangover and saying that, it's our federal taxes, blah, 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 right?
right, and you constantly hear people saying, "Our federal tax dollars are paying for this. Our federal tax dollars, okay, are paying for that." Uh, that's not true. There's no such thing at the federal level as federal tax dollars paying for anything. What pays for things is congressional appropriations and the power of the Federal Reserve to create new funds that it places in the Treasury spending account so Treasury is then able to spend. And this gets us into the political issues somewhat. People are constantly asking questions of other people who propose policies. How are you going to pay for it? Why do they ask that how you're going to pay for it question? Okay, in other words, if the whole thing is completely transparent, that Congress appropriates the funding, then it should be completely transparent how we're going to pay for everything. We just have Congress appropriate it and it will be spent. But the reason why people don't understand that or doubt that very simple explanation is they see taxes, okay, and revenues from the sale of bonds. They see that going into the federal government and they don't understand that those revenues are destroyed during settlement and so uh, cannot possibly pay for anything. They also don't understand that it's the authority of Congress delegated to the Federal Reserve that actually pays for things, and that this is appropriate from the standpoint of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which gives that authority to the Congress. So, I will move on to the next slide. Sectoral Financial Balances. This is another difficult one for some people to get their heads around. It should not be because, but fundamentally, there's very simple process, okay, that's involved here. Okay, if you look at three sectors of the economy, a domestic non-government sector and a domestic government sector, okay, and a foreign sector, it's just an arbitrary thing to do to split up the economy into those three sectors. It's just an analytical device. Okay, but once you've defined these three sectors, then you can ask the question: are these sectors transacting with one another during a time period? And since there's going to be a sum of dollars that will be transacted in the whole system when you're talking about, okay, a time period, and since there have to be flows because the three sectors are trading financial assets, okay, with one another during any time period, each sector is gaining financial assets from the other sector, and each sector is losing financial assets from the other sectors. So when you look at it as a gain or a loss constantly going on, you can visualize it like this. There are transactions going from the government to the domestic non-government sector, and the non-government sector is transacting with the government sector. That's what taxes are. It's paying taxes to the government sector. Okay, the domestic non-government sector is also sending goods to the foreign sector. It's exporting goods to the foreign sector, and the foreign sector is paying dollars for those goods to the domestic non-government sector. Furthermore, the foreign sector is also transacting with the government in certain ways. Fees, tariffs, maybe buying some things from the government. Okay, and the government may also be buying some things from the foreign sector. For example, the military buys tanks from the foreign sector. Okay, so the government is also sending money to the foreign sector. Okay, so if you visualize these flows going on in any period of time, the government sector could be in surplus. It could be getting more dollars than it's sending out to the other sectors. Or the government sector could be in deficit because it could be sending more money to the other sectors than it's getting from those other two sectors. The same thing applies to the domestic non-government sector. It could be receiving more dollars than it's getting it could be receiving more dollars than it's giving, than it's sending to the other two sectors. The same thing is true of the foreign sector. Since there's only a total sum of dollars being transacted in the system, the gains and losses among the sectors, the various sectors, have to equal zero by definition. In other words, all of these flows are going to equal zero because the way we've set up the equation. That equation, that is the domestic non-government balance. Okay, the balance is basically whether it's a surplus, okay, or whether it's a deficit, how much of a surplus, how much of a deficit, plus the domestic government balance plus the foreign balance is going to be equal to zero because there's a fixed sum of dollars constituting the flow, or the flows, I should say. The equation says that the sum of all the flows for the three sectors of the economy is zero because there's only so much in assets traded in any time period. The positive balances of one or more sectors compared to the others must be matched by the negative balances of the other two sectors. That's the important idea to grasp, that the losses, the net losses of one sector have to be net gains for one or both of the other sectors. Okay, so let's think about that for a minute. Let me go further here. There's the picture and the equation again. So, for example, when the annual domestic non-government sector balance is positive, more financial assets are flowing to that sector taken as a whole than it is sending to the other sectors. Similarly, when the annual foreign sector balance is positive, more financial assets are being sent to that sector than it is sending to the other two sectors. When the annual government sector balance is positive, then it is getting more in financial assets from the other two sectors combined than it is sending to them.
Called a surplus.
That's the surplus situation. When it is in surplus, one or both of the other two sectors are in deficit compared to the government sector. There has to be at least one of the other two sectors that is going to be, in deficit. It is not necessary that both of the other sectors be in deficit when the government sector is in surplus, when it's positive. So that point is important, for us to note. The other obvious point, that's important is that when the government sector balance is negative, when the government is in deficit, that's going to be good for one or both of the other two sectors because they'll be getting the dollars. Okay. So conversely, when a non-government sector balance is negative, that sector is sending more to the other two sectors than it is getting from them.
So they're losing assets is what it comes down to. You're losing assets when you are in a surplus from outside of the government. The government is in surplus. That means that one of the private sectors, either foreign or domestic, is giving up assets to the government.
That's
So
right.
they're taking money out of circulation in that sector.
Absolutely correct. Okay, now the non-government sector, uh, the non-government sector balance can be positive, um, um, even though the government sector balance is also positive. How can that be? It could be that the United States, that the government sector here, for example, could have a trade surplus, and the trade surplus could be larger than the government surplus. If it's larger than the government surplus, our domestic private sector could still be in surplus. In that case, it would be the foreign sector that would be losing money. However, for a very, very, very long time now, for maybe 25 years at least, or 28 years, I think it is, we have not had a trade surplus in the United States. We've always had, okay, a trade deficit, which means that the other two sectors are losing dollars to the foreign sector, that they are paying more dollars to the foreign sector than they are getting in return. That's the norm for the United States for at least a quarter century or more. Okay, now, in the old days, in 1960s, the 1970s, even for much of the 1980s, we were running trade surpluses. That turned around actually during the 90s. And during the 20 years since the 90s, we have not had a trade surplus even once. We've always run, okay, a trade deficit.
Because we offshored everything.
Sometimes the trade deficit has been as high as 6%, okay, of GDP. Now, there's nothing necessarily bad about that. It represents, okay, the desires of the American people, okay, and the economy, the private sector economy, uh, to get more goods from the foreign sector than we, okay, are sending to the foreign sector. So we import more in dollar value, but then we export. There's nothing that's inherently wrong with that, as long, okay, as other nations are willing to take our reserves, okay, or our currency. So it all depends on the trading desires, okay, of the other nations. If they're satisfied with getting dollars in return for the real goods they send to us, then everybody is happy with that situation. Of course, it may well be the case that that's not going to be the norm forever. We may have a change in our trade balance. But it's very hard to predict when such a trade is going to occur. Okay, because right now, with all the trade we have with China, they still seem to be in the market for dollars and are willing to trade uh, but real assets for those dollars. When China someday decides that it no longer is willing to do that, it may be the case that other nations would be willing to do that. If we reach a situation where very few nations, okay, are willing to do that, then guess what? We're going to have to manufacture goods here because foreign nations won't be willing to take our dollars in return for their goods. We cannot tell exactly when that's going to happen, but right now, in the present situation, we are the beneficiaries of getting goods in in return for dollars. Uh, Obviously, it's important to keep track of the sectoral balances. And the reason why, it is because we then know each year whether the private sector is getting into a situation where it's continually losing net financial assets. It's an important part, of MMT to point out that since the private sector isn't able to create the money, the currency, the reserves, that it cannot keep on losing financial assets to other sectors. So what happens? Okay. So far, I've talked about sectoral financial balances just as an accounting equation. But sectoral financial balances leave the realm, of definition and become important as a way of looking at the world that is testable when we leave the realm of mere accounting identities by using what we think is the sectoral financial balance situation in a predictive way. Then that true by definition accounting identity becomes an empirical hypothesis that we test in various ways. For example, when the foreign sector and the domestic non-government sector are running balances that are positive, then the government sector must be negative by the sum of the other two sectors. In other words, the government sector must be in deficit. If we have a situation that our domestic economy and the foreign sector are both in surplus, then that surplus cannot be supported. Only way it can be supported is if the government is in deficit. So we know, for example, when we have a government that's running big deficits, like for example, the Trump administration was running very big deficits. So we know just from that fact that one, at least, of the foreign sector, or perhaps the private sector here, would be running surpluses. So if we watch the patterns of government spending and we see the government is always in deficit, then we know that things are good for the foreign sector, for the domestic sector, on a macro basis, of course, uh, at least to one of those two sectors and maybe for both. On the other hand, when the government sector is in surplus, when it's positive, and the foreign sector is also positive because we have a trade deficit, then the non-government sector must be negative. In other words, the private sector here must be negative. At a macro level, it will be losing money taken as a whole. And of course, this is, a macroeconomic model. So we're looking at things as a whole. So when this goes on for years at a time, then the stress on economic activity in the non-government sector can be enough to cause a recession. For example, you could track the fact that in the latter days of the 1990s, the government here was running a surplus. There were 4 straight years of surplus, which the Clinton administration was celebrating. Oh, it was wonderful. It was so good. They were forecasting there were going to be years and years of surplus going on, and how wonderful that was going to be for the budget. Okay. But the government was in surplus. There were trade deficits that were getting pretty large at that time. So the private sector here was running a deficit. And it ran a deficit from something like, I don't know, maybe 1995. I mean, I could look it up, okay, exactly, but roughly from 1995 to the year 2000. Guess what happened in the year 2000? We had a recession in the year 2000. If you recall, the internet boom stopped. The financing of new ventures on the internet collapsed almost overnight. And in the very last year of the administration, okay, the Clinton administration, the year 2000, we had a recession, and it lasted from 2000 to 2002. It was not a terribly serious recession, but it set the stage. It set the stage for the collapse of 2007, 2000, K and 8. And the reason why it set that stage was because of what we did in order to try to recover from that recession. One thing we did is we had the Iraq War. We had a burst of military spending by the government. And we also had a housing boom by the private sector starting at the same time. The private sector housing boom was causing an explosion, okay, of debt, which people didn't pay a great deal of attention to because the paper values of their houses were going up and up and up because of a bubble that was created by the banks in the private sector. Remember, the federal government's not the only one creating money in our system. The private banks create money too, and they create more money than the federal government. In other words, they create more money, but they don't create more net financial assets. Government deficit spending creates a net financial asset. But when private sector banks do loans, there's no net financial asset that's created by that because the loans have to be paid back at some point in time. Now, while all this is going on, there might be a bubble created because the housing market is very, very hot and everybody thinks the economy is doing great. But in fact, those valuations of houses are in most instances paper values because it is a bubble. And at some point, that bubble is going to burst because the ability of people to go into further debt won't be supported by the bubble. Well, the effect of the bubble ran out in 2007 when there was a major housing crisis. And then that housing crisis began to feed into the failure of firms, including financial firms, and led to the crash of 2000, K and 8. which was the most serious recession we'd had since the end of the Second World War. So you could see that we were in trouble because of the years of surplus from 1995 to 2000. One could see that was going to be trouble because the private sector was losing money each of those years, losing net financial assets, and then was replacing the net financial assets with loans that were being bought to buy houses that were overvalued due to the bubble. So, okay, it's hard to predict exactly when the financial sector will decide to pull back. But the financial sector began to pull back in the housing market in 2007. And then in 2008, certain important financial firms began to fail. And then it was no longer go, go, go. It was simply pull back. And of course, what also contributed to this was the trading of novel financial securities in what had become an international gambling casino. The CDOs, okay, and the CDSs, those were packages of financial securities that were way overvalued. And when the financial sector decided to pull back, it recognized that those, okay, were overvalued and began to question, okay, their values. And credit tightened up. Some of the important firms started to fail, like Lehman Brothers. And we suddenly had a major financial crisis on our hands in 2008, which, by the way, very, very few predicted in 2007, even though the housing crisis started in 2007. So all this is to illustrate that watching the sectoral financial balances and what is happening there can be predictive of problems to come. The MMTers by 2002 were predicting problems to come. Okay, now the approach is not so precise in terms of the modeling aspect that it was able to predict the actual time, okay, when this was going to happen. But it was pretty clear to MMTers in the period, well, first of all, in the period before the recession of 2000 and 2002, that we were going to be in trouble. But when we entered the recession, the MMTers were immediately calling it a recession, analyzing what went wrong. And when that recession eased because of the financial bubble and because of the military spending, they saw that that was only a temporary postponement of the problems, and that down the road there were going to be even bigger problems. And that's what happened, of course, at the end of the Bush administration and the onset of the Obama administration. So that's sectoral balances. Are there any questions at this point?
Mana makes a comment up here about two sectors not being able to be running in. Wait a minute, let me go find it. Or Teresa does. She says, maybe it would be helpful, Joe, if you explained what the deficit clock actually represents. Two sectors can't be in surplus at the same time, you mean? That's her question.
Oh, no, two sectors can be in surplus okay, at the same time. The foreign sector can be in surplus, and the private sector can be, okay, in surplus. But it's impossible for three sectors to be in surplus. So if two sectors are in surplus, that means the government sector has to be, okay, in deficit. Okay, and not only that, the deficit of the government sector has to be equal to the surpluses of the other two sectors combined. Do you see why that's true, Lana? Because the balance of all three sectors has to be equal to zero. It's fixed, okay, at zero. So let's say that the government deficit is 10%. It's then possible for the foreign sector to be in surplus by 3%, and for the domestic the private sector to be in surplus uh, of 7%, okay, of GDP. 7% plus 3% is 10%. Okay. Does that answer your question, Lana?
She'll be back, I'm sure. She is working, she is saying, so I'm assuming she's going to come back.
Okay, so she can come back and she can tell us. Oh, there's Stephen Hill. Hi, Stephen.
Yes, it's very
I'm
nice
glad
to
to
see
see you're
you.
here.
So, something that Kay and Teresa are discussing is that they think, well, Kay is saying that she thinks that there is a housing bubble now. I agree with her. And Teresa points out about the financial sector snapping up every available house and jacking up rents people can't afford. You know, the crash, the financial crash of 2008 was directly related to the mortgage debacle. I was in the middle of that. I was in Washington Mutual working for the corporate controllers division, and I'd been in there for 8 years at the time. But it's really interesting to me because I was on the inside of that. You know, we all were aware of many things that were going on that were wrong all at the same time in the housing market, in that whole industry. Not only the products that were being sold, you know, the mortgage products that were being underwritten, there were low doc mortgages, there were ARMs that were being written that would adjust. Then there were appraisals that were being done that were questionable, right? I mean, there were so many pieces of that puzzle, but truly, the worst side of that is that the banks were incentivized, and I don't mean that they were asked to do these things, but there was an incentive to churn out subprime mortgages. And if they could securitize them, in other words, put them into like a mutual fund, right? We're going to take not so great mortgages and then AAA rated mortgages. We're going to put them into a security, and we're going to put a derivative on either end. So in other words, insurance, so that if the subprime mortgages started to falter, they had derivatives there that were supposedly supposed to offset the losses. Okay?
Yes, yes, yes. There
But
was a
it
lot.
wasn't.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you know, the financial markets, I think one of the things that is really a dichotomy within is that it's so technical and it's so specific and researched and analyzed and that yada 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 yada. But there's a lot to say for the fact that if people don't believe in the markets anymore, all of that technical, all of that analysis, all of that market, all of that demand for these securities can dry up in a second. And when the demand for that dries up, that's when the dominoes started to fall. And boy, did they go all the way
Yeah,
through.
loss of trust.
Hmm.
Loss of trust with respect to the securities.
And and it was worse than that though, Joe, because those of us in the banking industry realized when they start. I mean, there were rumblings inside for a very long time that anybody who was really astute to the bigger picture knew that this was just not going to last. It wasn't a good idea.
Yes.
And you had to be in the center of either buying, selling, or refinancing a house, or taking out a construction loan and then having to assume that construction loan on your home. You had to be in that side of it, or writing mortgages, right? And then, but again, we had both sides at the time, where you started to understand that, the appreciation on your home that allowed you to take out that loan, or that,
Yes.
you know, was almost too good to be true, right? And at the time, you could get the work done on your house, unlike now, where the raw materials and the labor were relatively stable. Okay, they weren't astronomically increasing like we've got now. I mean, we got a lot of things wrong now, and I
Oh
don't even
yeah,
know.
we didn't have inflation then.
Right,
That's,
right,
there was asset inflation in terms of the houses,
yes,
but we didn't have the inflation with respect to the supply chain problems or the price gouging for everyday things that we have now.
correct. But then when things got shaky, one of the reasons that Washington Mutual Bank was put into receivership, the FDIC came in, seized the bank, and put it into receivership, is because we had 52,000 employees across the country, and those of us on the inside could see the writing on the wall after uh, Lehman. Was it Lehman that went first? I think it was Lehman. Am I off base here?
Yeah, Lehman was the one that got into trouble first.
Lehman went first, and then everybody was just like, "Oh crap!" Now,
Right, and they started going into situation. Then the next to have a problem, okay, was Morgan Stanley.
yeah,
And
yeah,
Morgan Stanley had to be bought by Bank of America to save it.
And then there were some other ones, but at that point, we all knew, the people on the inside, we all knew that things were really. I mean, we could see, like, holy crap, Lehman just disappeared, and now we've got Wachovia was in trouble, and Bank of America was in trouble, and we were standing here just holding our breath, right? And we started pulling our money out of the bank
Hmm.
because we had heard grumblings of how bad it was, and the employees, they were backed up around the block taking their
Oh my
money out of the
God.
bank. And that's why they seized WAMU, because there was a walk on the bank. And I was on the phone with my parents while I was standing in line telling them, go get some cash, get some liquidity, take it out of the bank and stick it in your safe. And my parents were like, "What are you talking about?" And I said,
Well, that
"Listen,
was a classic panic.
I said, you can laugh at me later if I'm wrong. I'm just telling you to my parents." I said, I'm not telling the world, but I'm telling you guys. Because there was talk of them shutting the banking system down for 3 days. And
Yes,
that did not really hit the news, because that in and of itself would have caused a panic. But we were on the inside. We knew what was going on.
yes.
So, and that was all caused by a series of things. It wasn't just the subprime mortgages. It wasn't just the securitizations. It wasn't just the appraisals, and it was a lot of things,
It was
right?
all those things put together happening
All
at
of
the
it
same time.
combined.
Yes.
Yep, all of it combined.
Okay, we have a dangerous situation now, and one of the big elements in that situation is because the Biden administration has absorbed some MMT in terms of its recognition that the federal government has the power to spend a lot of money quickly. Okay. However, it has not absorbed the part of MMT that says that it can be very harmful to view fiscal responsibility as equivalent, okay, to reducing the deficit. So the Biden administration in recent months has embarked on a project to reduce the deficit as much as it can in order to become fiscally responsible in terms of the old perception of what that actually means. And it is priding itself now that it has been getting closer and closer to, having a neutral position with respect to the deficit. We still have a trade deficit, though. Okay, we have a current account deficit, and since we do, we need the federal government to be running deficits to compensate for that. Because if, let's say, our trade deficit is 3% at this time, if the federal government does not run a deficit itself that's more than 3%, then the private sector will be in deficit. Okay, and if the deficit is a substantial deficit, that means the private sector will be losing money. People will begin to perceive that the private sector is losing money, and that could trigger a recession. So the fiscal position that the Biden administration has been adapting since the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022 is very misconceived and very dangerous, because we don't have an inflation that's being caused by demand, too much demand. We have an inflation that's being caused by supply chain problems and by price gouging. And those two things pretty much account for all the inflation that we are seeing. And we know that. And the Biden administration and the monetary authorities at the Fed are trying to use classical points of view to treat that, like cutting back on government spending for the Biden administration, okay, and raising interest rates. The Federal Reserve, okay, is raising those interest rates. These are foolhardy things to do because the immediate effect of raising interest rates is actually inflationary as opposed to deflationary, because the interest getting paid is higher. Okay. And of course, the flow of money from the government to the private sector is now radically slowed down. This is not a good sign. It's one of the conditions that have to be there for a recession to start. And Biden is playing into that. He probably has one or two advisors in his administration telling him that this could be dangerous. Jared Bernstein, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But there are not a lot of MMTers, okay, in this administration. You've got some people who have kind of sketchy knowledge, of MMT, like Jared. But really, the MMT pioneers, or people they educated, are not a part of the administration right now. And they are not warning against this, but this administration could easily fall into a trap.
I think it's already done that.
Yeah, I think it's already done that
I think
too.
we're already there.
If this should cause a recession,
It's going to be a big one.
which, by the way, the Ukraine war has exacerbated the problem, okay, as well,
Mhm.
okay, because it's exacerbating the inflation, right, that we have here, which then the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve will try to tamp down with remedies that do not work for that kind of cost push inflation. And that's going to trigger the recession even more quickly. But I can't express my feelings that I can't express the feelings I have about the stupidity of this administration right now, both in foreign policy and also domestic policy. It is running. I mean, it has all kinds of electoral problems right now. Everything it's doing is going to make things worse. Anyway, that's those are
Well,
finishes.
so I mean, when we get back down to who is in surplus and uh who isn't, right? The uh the situation at hand right now, and I think it has been for a long time, very long time, we do not have representation and policy in the government at the federal level right now that has any concern about the micro and the 40% of the population that is in poverty, which is the statistics that are coming out now. The private sector is the corporate sector, the banking sector. It is no longer the concern about, you know, what happens to the people on the ground. Okay, when when the inflation starts going and wages are stagnating, and I actually heard somebody mention the other day about uh, not price fixing, wage fixing, which is ridiculous. Our wages have been fixed for 40 damned years. It's We've lost, from a policy perspective, the thread on how badly the people are suffering. It's almost as if that's all right. There's enough of them that we can burden them, and nobody else has to worry about where the money's going to come from. You know.
Yes, I entirely agree. They don't appreciate the sufferings of the rest of us. And this is in part, of course, because of the ideology they have. They're committed to, a neoliberal type, okay, of ideology. The elites in this country have been following that, okay, for years. There is no, there is no appreciation, okay, no empathy uh, for people closer to the bottom and what they, okay, are suffering.
Well, they still have their voting blocks intact. Those folks that are going to pretty much get them elected, that voting block is insulated to a big extent from a lot of what the younger generations are feeling, and a lot of what the impoverished individuals who aren't their voting blocks per se.
Yes, that's true. But if things keep going the way they are going, 2022 is going to be a total slaughter, and they won't be able to avoid that. They'll be completely submerged, and the Republicans will have their way, and they'll do everything they can to sabotage everything so that they can be assured of beating Biden in 2000.
Lana's calling me absurd.
Huh?
Lana made a comment about taking money out of the bank. She says that's absurd. Lana, at the time that was going on, when we were on the inside and we were watching that happen for months, and then it was all out panic on the inside, and then we heard that they were going to shut the banking system down, or they were talking about shutting the banking system down. It wasn't absurd at the time. That's why the bank itself was seized.
Okay, so I'd like to finish this with 2 points because we're getting on now. It's about 10:20. So I will be postponing the job guarantee for a future stream. I don't know whether it will be next Tuesday. Uh, what I'm saving these streams for is the situations where uh, we have not been able to continue the discussion of the response to the IPCC report with one of the MMT guests that we would like to have on the show. And so basically, I decided to go through the various parts of the presentation uh, in order to fill in the gaps while at the same time educating people better with respect to MMT. But 2 more points is the concept of macroeconomic austerity. There is medium to long-term fiscal policy characterized by a focus on reducing budget deficits or increasing budget surpluses. Of course, we haven't had a budget surplus at the federal level now for a very long time, not since 2000. Okay. And most often on the former, because a lot of times during the Obama administration, and the reason why it was the administration that had the slowest recovery from a recession since the Second World War is because of Obama's focus on reducing budget deficits, his continual focus on that, which eventually created a situation where the trade deficits were nearly equal to the budget deficits. That's probably what more than anything else accounted for the dissatisfaction that led to the election of Trump. But anyway, going further.
Well, you know what else? There was money appropriated to save Main Street in that mortgage debacle, and they never, ever got it to the people. And that I think had more to do with the languishing of the recovery than anything. People couldn't sell their homes, they were underwater, their credit was ruined, they were losing their houses, they were having to move. I mean,
Yeah, I think that was true in 2009, 2010. Um, 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 uh, in those years, that's what really was the bottom of the recession. But as we began to recover, the Obama administration was pushing from the other direction to get back to a deficit neutral position or even a surplus. He was looking at the Clinton administration at his model, and I think he wanted to go for surpluses. He never got to surpluses, but he was getting pretty close by 2015. So there was not enough federal money going into the system. And of course, the Republicans were only too happy to collaborate with him on that after they gained control of the House and eventually the Senate as well.
well,
They
that's
were
when
happy
they
to
stopped
work with him.
funding all the regulatory operations.
Yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes.
Hmm.
But that went back to the 90s.
No, I know that, but he did a bunch. There was even more in play before him.
Yes,
And
yes.
I mean, it's painstaking what they had to do to get the Affordable Care Act off the ground from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay, so to finish the point, when you have an environment where one's nation is running trade deficits larger than the government deficits, that's a state of macroeconomic austerity because uh, a sufficient amount of money is not flowing to the private sector. The private sector is in deficit. Okay. So that situation of austerity, that kind of austerity, was being approached by the Obama administration towards the end of the administration. Okay. And one other point to reinforce that: if foreign sector is in surplus and the government sector, okay, is in deficit, then the domestic non-government sector must also be, okay, in deficit. In other words, those two deficits uh, have to equal the foreign sector surplus. And then there's the concept of microeconomic austerity as well. Let me finish macroeconomic. So that's the consequence of a long-term fiscal policy aimed at budget surpluses. Closer it gets to its goal, the more it approaches continuous losses for the domestic non-government sector. So the U.S. was approaching macroeconomic austerity under Obama because the government deficit was barely greater than the foreign surplus. By running large deficits, the Trump administration relieved the state of macroeconomic austerity. But now the Biden administration is once again moving towards macroeconomic austerity because it has learned the wrong lessons. Then there's microeconomic austerity. That embodies the same idea as macroeconomic austerity, except that it applies to subsectors of the foreign and private sector rather than to each sector taken as a whole. So, during the Trump administration, there was a lot of macroeconomic prosperity for the wealthy, for the 1%, for the cronies of the administration.
The oligarchy.
But there was still microeconomic austerity because the distribution of the macroeconomic surpluses was highly unequal during the Trump administration.
I think it's worse now.
Yeah, I think it's also worse now because we're approaching a macroeconomic austerity situation with the Biden administration, and at the same time, the distribution of the macroeconomic micro sectoral surpluses is unequal, with the rich companies and the wealthy people taking a disproportionate amount of government stimulus that is still barely available. So that's what's happening now. What I want to emphasize here is there's a distinction between macroeconomic austerity and microeconomic austerity. And you can have a situation of macroeconomic prosperity while you have microeconomic austerity. And yes, that is the situation I think we have now.
I think we've been there for years and years.
Well, I think so too, Lisa. I think so too. So that will be all for tonight, except for discussion. As I indicated, we'll take up the job guarantee the next time. I don't know whether next time will be next week or 2 weeks from now, but we shall see. So I hope you like this. I hope I clarified some parts of MMT for you. I think some very important parts of MMT. Okay, let's go through the questions and the comments. Okay, did you see any that looked very interesting, Lisa?
I think we talked about most of them, although I can't say that I was watching every single one. But I wanted to ask Lana what she was locking loans at today. I heard 6.5 around here yesterday. 2 days ago. 2 days ago, they were locking at 6.5. Now, mind you, I refinanced. We closed on January 27th, and I locked in at 2.4. I think 2.3.
So you're saying they were locking in the mortgage interest rates for
If
homes at
you want to lock, you have to lock a rate, and then you're usually 30 to 45 days before you close, right?
right.
So you're locking. You have to lock. You lock at a rate, and then you go through closing process, right?
Okay,
You have to
so
lock
now
that
they're
amount.
locking now at 6.5%, you're saying?
6.5 day before yesterday.
Oh my God. And how many weeks ago were they locking at 2.5?
Well, I initiated that. I think let's see, February 24th, we locked and we closed at the end of March, beginning of April, somewhere in there, right? So we locked. I think we locked at the end of February. We locked on the 24th of February at 2.3.
At 2.3%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And February 24th, if I recall correctly, was the date of the invasion, okay, of Ukraine.
February 24th was the invasion?
I think it was. I don't think it was March 24th, right? Because Ukraine's been going on for 2 months now, right?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't remember, but we locked before the invasion for sure. It
Yeah.
was, I mean, we were worried about whatever the hell was going to go on, but no, we locked before. So I don't know. It might have been the 21st, whatever it was.
Okay, so interest rates have gone up by 4 points in 2 months.
Yeah, for a loan.
The
Yeah.
mortgage interest rates.
Yep. Yep.
Very, very interesting. Interesting, but not good news.
Well, and then I think it was Wells Fargo laid off 600 and some loan officers,
Yeah, those, right.
right?
So Lana tells me, yes.
And there was something else that I was talking about because the woman that I was talking to, she does what Lana does. Um, actually, I think she might be inside. She might be a broker. Anyway, she was telling me that all of the business associated with remodels, right? A lot of wealthy individuals were remodeling their homes because you know their investments were good. They hadn't spent money for a couple of years, like they had been spending money before. So they decided while they were in their homes, they'd remodel their homes, la la la, right? People who could afford it. Didn't matter that the materials went up for them; they could do it anyway. And she was saying that that's like in the last month, that's all dried up, all of it, all of it.
Okay, so Teresa Sanders asks at 10:05, I don't understand how people can lose their mortgages in these bubbles, but investment by rental firms don't. Uh, okay, so she doesn't understand that, how people can lose their mortgages.
What do you mean?
I'm not sure what she means by lose their mortgages in the bubbles. As, for example,
They didn't lose their they lost their homes because they had uh, loan products that adjusted to um, they had like you get a fixed rate for 5 years and then after 5 years the payment adjusts, right? So their payments were going up. In the same sense, there was double whammy here. Your property value increased tremendously, and then all of a sudden the values of the homes were being marked down. Okay. If you had home equity loans or lines of credit on your home to do whatever, right? Because the property value fell so sharply, your mortgages were underwater and they were closing down your lines of credit, just pulling them. Like when you when you close a credit card, your credit score takes a hit. Well, if you've got a line of credit for $50,000 and they shut that down and you have, you know, $25,000, $30,000 that you owe on that, right? Your credit score takes a tank. You now are paying back that line of credit at a different payment. Your payments all adjust because it's no longer a low interest line of credit. They shut it down. Okay. So through this entire process, some people lost their homes because their arms adjusted and they couldn't make the payment. Some people lost their homes because they literally lost half of the value of their home. That happened to a family member of ours. They bought property and they bought it at 375, and after 2008, 2009, their house was literally worth $160,000.
Yeah.
That's how that kind of stuff happened. And then when people lost their jobs, and there were a lot of people in the sector who lost their jobs
Yes.
and were living off of their rolled over 401ks because they didn't have any income. And there were so many people in the banking industry, in the audit industry. I mean, when you shut down a Washington Mutual Bank, was it started in Seattle, and it had its hands in everything. And then it went and bought up and mergers and acquisitions, and it ended up being a national presence. But when you shut that down, they laid off a ton of people at Deloitte and Touche in Seattle, and a couple of the other firms. It was just cascading. There were so many businesses that went under because the big bank went under, right? And the other big bank there was Wells Fargo. Wells didn't seem to do too badly in the mess that happened. But we had Bank of America. It's hard to believe they made it through, but they did. Their stock was worth like $4 for a while. Nobody thought they were going to power through, but they made it, So there's a ripple effect when all of this happens. Small businesses go out because a lot of times certain small businesses, they're leveraged with their own homes to try and keep up when things turn down. But when you're in a situation like that where, your arm adjusts or your house is worth less and they're pulling your loans because you don't have the collateral anymore, right?
Yes.
I mean, it just snowballs in a big way. It gets bad quick. And instead of people being able to go to the bank and ask to refi their house, their mortgage, that was an arm that adjusted to a payment that they now couldn't handle, and there was supposed to be money there for them, the banks didn't lend it. They got it. The Congress approved it. The banks didn't lend it. They lost their houses.
So Teresa points out, it's crazy. I get 2 to 4 contacts per week trying to buy my house.
Well,
So-
there were a lot of people that were paying cash for mortgages even, 2 months ago.
Yes.
Right. Now and there will probably be more. There'll be things are going to change, though. It's not going to be the same because there's a lot. I mean, like there's this development going in that we don't want to have go in. And now that interest rates are so bad, I have a funny feeling we're going to have an easier time thwarting that development. They haven't sold the land yet.
Yeah. What's going to happen to BlackRock if there's a collapse of the bubble?
Well, if people can't afford to buy houses, they're going to have to rent now, aren't they?
People are going to have to rent if they can't afford to buy houses. But okay, if suddenly the value, okay, of the houses that BlackRock just recently bought is collapsing, okay, along with the bubble, isn't there a chance that the government will turn to the strategy of basically buying BlackRock up or trying in some way to
I don't think it's going to
what,
be like. I don't think it's going to
they'll
be
be
like
too
that.
big to fail.
I don't think it's going to be like that this time, Joe, because the housing issues associated with the bubbles were based on low interest rates and demand. They weren't based on faulty underwriting this time, right? There's a difference there. In my neighborhood, we had all kinds of development going on around us, which, supposedly increases the value of your home. But then if I've got 70 houses going in that aren't going to be done for 2 years, and I personally think we're going to be in double digits by then, long before then. Those houses, they're not going to go like hotcakes. People aren't going to be coming in a double-digit inflationary situation and putting down cash like they were before. When credit tightens up like that, people hold on. They hold on. They're not so willing to, oh, I've got this cash, let me just lay it out. Things change. So in some senses, housing may hold its value, but if houses aren't selling, that's no reason to devalue the property itself. Okay? That's not going to devalue the property. There has to be a good reason to devalue the property, and I don't see those traceable, known faulty aspects of the underwriting of the homes right now. I think that a lot of pent up demand after COVID and everything is what caused what's going on with the housing markets now. But with interest rates the way they are, it's just, it's not going to keep going. It's not going to keep going. BlackRock, I don't care what happens to BlackRock. They have enough goddamn money to bail themselves out.
Oh, I don't care what happens to BlackRock either. The reason why, okay, I mentioned that is because if BlackRock should get in trouble,
Who, themselves? Who's BlackRock going to get into trouble with, Joe?
if housing values, if the bubble should completely collapse,
I don't think that's going to
and
happen.
BlackRock has bought, okay, a lot of houses at very high
They'll
price.
just rent them. They're just going to rent them. They're not renovating them. They're not flipping them. They're turning them into rentals.
Now I know I still wonder whether they're going to be sustained or not.
I think there's going to be a lot of
All I'm
demand for
saying
rentals.
is we might have to be ready to exert, tremendous pressure, against any bailout.
Oh, right. Like they've never stopped them before.
It's never stopped them before, but as you know, politics is changing. Uh,
Listen, Obama bailed out the big guys who owned all of the rental properties before he left, and it didn't even get a blip. I saw one article on it, one numero uno, and it didn't
right,
even go
but
viral.
guess what? Politically, it's no longer 2010. Okay, I'm not sure what it is,
I hope you're right, Joe, but I don't think so.
but it's no longer
Nobody's going to
2010.
hurt BlackRock. The only people that are going to get hurt are us.
I tend to agree with that too, of course. Lon says, I think the recession has started. My employer has started to lay people off. The housing market is a big player in the market. The mortgage rates are up. People are living on credit cards. Bad signs.
Yeah, all bad signs. Lana, what did she come back with? What she's locking loans at right now?
I haven't seen that yet.
Oh my God.
Lon says, at least I get it, but the FDIC guarantee any deposit up to 200K.
Yeah, I know that, but that's not the same thing. When they shut the banking system down, they shut the banking system down, and it was so bad that we were thinking it weren't coming back.
Yeah.
That's how bad it was, and people didn't know it.
Lon says 2008 was a complete poop show. There was nowhere to run for many people. I know people in the mortgage business that went into foreclosure. Oh, the irony.
It's so bad. I mean, it gives me nightmares when I think about it. It was so bad.
Steve Wolfbrand says 2022 will be a complete slaughter. Biden will be impeached. Hello, Kamala.
Oh God in heaven.
She might be impeached too. If Kevin McCarthy is Speaker of the House, they might want to.
Kamala cannot be president of the United States. She's going to cackle and dance her way to what?
Sandy says, yuck. Kay says, give me Bernie again. Lana says, hang on. Teresa says, good night. Started
28% of offers on homes are cash at present. Where are you at, Michael? Or are you talking nationally?
I don't know, but I'm with Lana at 10:30, who says, I closed in September 2.875%. I guess that was last September.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was her own loan. Lana says, the one in my hand fixed 360, 4.875.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And a brand new loan today, fixed 30 year,
5.25.
5.25%. Lana says, good night, Teresa. Sandy says they were at 18% in the 80s. Yeah, I know. I bought a house
In the 80s, they were 18?
at one point. Okay, in the 80s, the mortgage rates went really, really up high. We bought our house in 81 at 13%.
Oh, my Lord in heaven.
That was very high.
You refined it quickly, though, right?
Well, it was actually mortgage rates were pretty high for most of the 80s, so we never got a chance to refi it. It was a long time till those rates actually went down. The rates we see now, or we just recently saw, those were back to historically normal rates, which are very low. But the 1980s was very, very atypical. Kay says Bernie had a great live stream today with the ambassador from Norway. $20 an hour in McDonald's over there. Yes, I've known that for quite some time. Yeah, $20 an hour or $22 an hour. Okay, in many of the European countries. Sandy says we had to assume a mortgage. Robert Copeland says Healthy California Commission report that came out just yesterday say the people in California would save $500 billion over the next 10 years with CalCare.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to do single payer.
Yes.
Even the CBO knows it.
They do. Sandy says we had to put a big down payment down to get our house at 7%. Teresa says, so the investment buyers don't
down, then buy the
they
points
buy
down.
because Teresa still, I think, doesn't understand. The investment buyers don't lose all the homes they buy because
They can afford to hold on to them, Teresa, until they come back. And that's what they did. They hung on because it was
that's probably what they'll try to do now.
I don't think the real estate's going to take the hit this time, Joe. I don't think people are going to be buying, but there's no reason per se. There's no, the mortgage-backed securities aren't this hot commodity that the brokers are trading like crazy now. Okay.
You're right, and the assessors are not going crazy now.
Yeah, I mean that's not happening now. So the assets themselves might be inflated because of
Simply demand.
because okay, there is a lot of equity investment buying up real estate. That is true. And when you've got that kind of a hot commodity on the market, property values do increase. There's a lot of reasons why property values increase. Pent up demand gets released, yada, 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 yada. Lots of issues, sociological and what other, that had to do with COVID, people just changing how they live, la, 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 right? At the same time, you don't have toxic underwriting out there now. So I don't think that the assets themselves, unless they're mortgaged to the hilt, but they're not going to be underwritten with an arm. I don't know. The only way that rental property is going to devalue is if you have no one to rent to. And that could possibly happen. But with the rates that are going up the way they're going up now, I don't think there's going to be any problem owning a rental property right now, unless you're a slumlord. And even then, I don't think you're going to have a problem. I really don't. And I may be wrong, but that's my thinking on it.
Okay, Lana asks, going to ask this once again. Since we have more fiscal space when we don't make most of the stuff we use, how much time do you think we have until we make too much stuff here and not enough fiscal space?
Well, you're going to have to elaborate that for me. I'm not quite sure where that's going.
Well, I think that's where going is if we made more stuff here, we would be closer to a full employment situation, tight full employment. If we get to that space, then we have less fiscal space for deficit spending because when we reach that kind of situation, to put any more demand into the economy, uh, means we get a demand side inflation.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of damned hurt out there.
I think the answer to the question, Lana, is that uh, I don't think I can do a time calculation like that. It's too dynamic a situation. The reason why is um, as we begin to manufacture more, okay, we would have far more capacity to create stuff here.
We can't do that overnight, though, right? I mean, it's
No,
going to take
can't
a
do that.
while.
Right. We cannot do that overnight. It's going to be a period of years until we bring back some of the manufacturing to here, and we also have to make it green as
Yeah, I
well.
mean, we have to
So
repatriate industry and retool them. And somebody's going to have to come up with an innovation, and there's going to have to be a plan. Otherwise, you're just going to bring what I mean. God, we need a Green New Deal,
yes,
like now.
yes, we absolutely do. And of course, we're going to have a plan for containing inflation when we introduce the Green New Deal. There's been a lot of MMT research on that. Some good papers produced at Levy, and some good papers, at Fadl's center as well, the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity.
So, Joe, when they send $700 billion over to the Ukraine, is that deficit?
Uh, they haven't really determined that yet. Okay, in other words, what the federal government is doing is, uh, okay, if the Treasury spending account starts getting pressed because they spent, $700 billion over there, okay, uh, okay, then they're going to have to create some more money in the Treasury spending account. So to do that, uh, since they won't use platinum coins and overt congressional financing, uh, okay, what they will do is sell more treasuries. As long as those treasuries are still desired by the international system,
Well, that
which,
would be the dumbest thing to do right now ever, considering where we're at.
huh?
We're not going to issue treasuries in that amount. Like next week, you might send another 700 billion. I mean, seriously, we're going to issue treasuries now with what we don't even know what's going to happen next.
Okay, if the treasury spending account balance goes too low, they have a particular target. I'm not sure what it is now. It used to be $5 billion in the treasury spending account. They always wanted to have. I think now they're probably somewhere near 20 or 25 billion that they always like to have, because the churn, okay, of money.
Mm-hmm.
So if that limit is pressed on, they're going to issue treasuries, okay, in whatever quantity they think is necessary to keep the treasury spending account uh, continuing to have the capacity to spend the appropriations of Congress. Okay. Now, whether that is deficit spending or not will depend on whether uh, there's enough in later taxation to take it up. That's going to be the determining factor. But in passing that bill, that appropriation bill, they did not specify um, um, any taxes to take that up.
How would we know that bill? How big was that bill? I mean, we have no idea what's in it.
Yeah, I don't have any idea what's in it now, too. But you mentioned the figure 700 billion. No, it couldn't have
Or
been.
was it 700 million? I can't remember.
It
It
was
might have
probably
been million.
700 million because they're spending right now in Ukraine uh, in the low billions.
Okay, so it was 700 million that he approved, what, the day before yesterday?
If
On
that
top
was
of
if
something
that
like
was
that.
approved by Congress, the day before yesterday, that certainly didn't have any special taxes attached to it. Okay, that doesn't mean that the tax revenue is not going to cover it. In other words, the tax revenue coming in still might be sufficient to cover it. Uh, okay, if Biden wants to continue to try to be fiscally responsible, and get to a deficit neutral position, then they will have to increase taxation to cover these expenses for the war. But that actually might stop him from, trying to reduce the deficit. So in that sense, it might be better for us. Now, how much of the 700 billion would
Million.
be, 700 million, sorry, how much of it
Mhm.
would be spent over there as opposed to here? Okay, I don't know. If it
I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole because
okay,
somebody did on
if
Twitter.
it's spent over there, then it would be dollars that we spend in the foreign sector. In other words, dollars sent to the foreign sector and would increase the trade deficit. If we spend it here, it stays, inside of the domestic economy.
So it could be funding to get goods over there as opposed to sending actual currency to them transactionally or however you want to look at it.
It could be funding to pay for the transportation. It could be part of the funding could be used to buy goods overseas. But
Mm.
for example, we're supposedly bringing equipment to the Ukraine that was Poland's equipment, and that is relatively old equipment. And some of the other the East European nations. So whether we're borrowing that, okay, or buying it, I hear there are plans to replace it with new equipment, which will be sold by Raytheon and other members of the military industrial complex to replace the old equipment that is now being sent into the Ukraine. The Scott Ritter says it's old equipment that's being sent over to Ukraine right now.
How about diplomacy?
Huh? I'm sorry. How about what?
How about diplomacy? I mean, I can't even. I don't want to go down. I don't want to get all upset about this, but like all wars are ended with a diplomatic solution, unless we do something stupid. But and we have. But all wars are ended with a diplomatic solution, and we just abandon it.
This is getting. There's a deliberate attempt by the war hawks in Washington, Tony Blinken, okay, and his collaborators, to split up the world into basically the Asian sphere and us, and they expect a market basket of currencies
Hmm.
for China, Russia, for India, some of the other countries, and then they expect to have a dollar sphere. So they're trying to create a Cold War that is going to cover both the military sphere and the economic sphere, and it's just insane. It's bad for the world economy. We're all going to be lesser for it.
I just can't understand. I can't understand. I thought people were at least. I just thought that people had a conscience. I don't know.
And they just want to continue the domination of as much of the world as they can have, by the United States, and they just seem hell bent on that. I mean, why else provoke the Russians for so long, for years and years and years, provocations?
I don't know, but I'm having a real hard time with all of it. I
Yeah,
really am. I mean, it affects everyone and everything, and economically, it's going to put us in a tailspin, and inflation is just going to go through the roof. And newsflash, we can't supply Germany with their oil. Nice idea, not really. It's stupid. We can't do it. It's the most ridiculous thing. I hear about these ideas.
it's not just the oil; it's the natural gas. The liquid natural gas, which is very, very important for Germany. I have the impression that Germany is not going to sit still for it for very long. They will see it's impractical, and they're going to
Oh, I
continue
think they already know.
the Russians.
I mean, what America is not getting right now is all of the commentary that is coming from the EU Parliament, and we're not getting the mainstream media addressing what's really going on. Most of America thinks that this is just about Putin wanting to take Ukraine back into Russia. That is where their intellect stops. Now, to their credit, you're not getting anything more than that from the mainstream media.
Right. That
Just to let them know,
certainly
Joe.
is happening. They are not listening to other voices that know a lot about the balance of power, foreign policy, okay, and specifically where Ukraine fits and where they do not fit. And what really gets me is they're sacrificing the Ukraine. In other words, the losses, okay, the destruction. It's really
Because we didn't sit down and engage in diplomacy. Yeah. Yeah, we abandon it.
okay. It's worse than that. The
Yeah,
Minsk
I know. I know.
one and the Minsk two agreements
I know, Joe. We
were
talked about
agreed
this.
upon by all parties, and we got the Ukraine to break those agreements.
Yeah, I know. And it's disgusting. And what's more disgusting to me is the American people being so ignorant that they really. I think it is a choice. You have to not want to see what's going on when it comes to the fact that we are not sitting down and doing diplomatic negotiations.
Yeah. Okay. Lana points out my boss said the other day usually when the rates go up, the prices go down, or at least stay the same. So far, housing prices are still going higher. Uh, and Robert Copeland says, I heard people from the Bay Area paying cash for a house in Placerville, which is east of Sacramento. And my,
Utah is the hottest market in the country right now.
jeez, amazing. Steve says, at least Steve Donziger
Oh,
is
I'm sorry,
free
Idaho.
and Chris Smalls is winning. Yeah, that, okay, is very good news. And we'll be covering some of that tomorrow night, because tomorrow night is going to be a news show, because yesterday was quite a news day. And so we're going to be covering a number of news articles tomorrow on the in-depth show.
Can we have Steve on with us? Would he do it?
Huh?
Steve Wolfbrand. We've been trying to get him to come on here for a long time. Maybe he'll come on with us tomorrow.
Yeah. Hey, Steve, how would you like to come on with us tomorrow night
Come on, it'll be fun.
in order to discuss these articles? So Lana says, but BlackRock helped keep prices going up. And Lana says they shouldn't be allowed to own that many houses. Steve says, F BlackRock.
Amen to that.
There's a lot of discussion going on here about what's going on in the real estate market. Steve says the housing inventory is low, demand is high. And Lana says, exactly, Steve, and BlackRock is part of the problem with the low inventory, because it's buying up everything in sight. Wants a corner on the market. Robert says Kamala couldn't even win in her own state of California when she ran for president. Yeah. And she's not exactly more popular now than she was then.
Run my gerbil for president.
Kay says my rates were 13%. Yeah, mine too. Jeff Denton says a simple web search told me that Vanguard owns controlling shares in BlackRock, but it won't show you who owns controlling shares in Vanguard.
I
So
thought it was the other way around. Is that right? Vanguard owns BlackRock? I thought BlackRock owns Vanguard.
no, I think that's right. I think they do own controlling shares, okay, in BlackRock, but we can investigate afterwards and see what happens. My employer in 1981 came out with the first adjustable loan called Camp City Affordable Mortgage Program with fixed 1% increments for the first 5 years. Qualify at the start rate. Those were the days. Then everybody had to turn their houses after about 3 years.
Yep. Yep,
Steve,
those are those garbage
you want to
products.
make us all renters at very high rents, of course.
Well, it wasn't a bad idea, because if it would have worked the way that it was intended. When they sat down with people where I was, and Seattle was a really hot market back then, they would say to people, well, you're making money now, but certainly you're going to be making a lot more money in 5 years.
Yep, that's what they said.
Mhm.
And that's the way it looked from a common sense point of view. Steve wants to know if there's an election that Kamala actually won. There are none, he says.
I've
She was
heard that. I didn't realize that she didn't win a single election. I don't even know how that's possible.
she's so popular. I've been hearing that a lot of apartment complexes that are being built but are sitting empty in the Bay Area. Maybe because they're charging too much. Kay says they want us all living on the streets. If we spent less on the military industrial complex, we have plenty of fiscal space for Medicare for all, for Green New Deal, for the job guarantee without needing taxes to offset. That will change when we produce more of our own stuff. Yeah.
Like what stuff?
Yeah, but on the other hand, if we produce more of our own stuff, there will be more jobs and there will be
Like,
higher pay for people and there.
I, I think that we could do that for at least a decade. I, I mean, look at what we've been neglecting this country for 30 years.
Yeah,
I don't know. I just don't see, by the time we got to get it together, it's a perfect time to do this switch. It's a perfect time to reform the healthcare system. It's a perfect time to do a federal jobs guarantee. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know
yes,
how
I
much.
agree. I agree. It's a perfect time, but not a perfect time. But from the political point of view, it's a perfect time from the economic point of view. I entirely agree with that.
Well, I'm just terrified of what it's going to look like, Joe, if we don't do something. I'm terrified, and I don't get spooked. And I'm not terrified for myself. I'm terrified for the mass of us, all of us. I mean, it's just not, there's so many people that aren't working, that are struggling, that have cut back as far as they can cut back. Now inflation is coming and people, and now we're going to what?
The Biden,
Inflation.
the Biden administration has completely failed, and it will not do. It will not do what it has the power to do, by executive order. In spite of the fact that to have a chance for Democrats to win again in 2022 or 2024, it just has to do those things because it can't get anything through Congress. Steve says, so basically in World War III, NATO fighting Russia by proxy, this is very dangerous. It is very dangerous. Boomers remain much more influenced by the Cold War than they realize. Hey, Sherry. Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And we still have discussion going on here. When NATO surrounds Russia, up to her. Steve says, borders, what do you expect to happen? I know what I expect to happen. I expect war to happen. Sandy says, Kamala had other charms. Sherry says, I am a boomer myself. I have been very disappointed in many of my peers. Lana says, I just wish they had spent more for the public purpose when we had more fiscal space. Lana, we can tax in order to create more fiscal space,
Yeah, I mean, we've got an oligarchy that needs their asses handed to them in taxes.
If we have to tax, we can tax. The problem is, it's a political problem. It comes back to dump the incumbents again.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Got to have people in there who will tax if they have to tax to fight inflation, who will regulate if they have to regulate to fight inflation. All those things have to be done.
Well, but I think what she's getting at, though, is that nobody, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, and things just right now are just tenuous.
I don't think it's a damned if we do or damned if we don't situation. It's I don't think we're damned if we change the political situation so we can do.
Well,
I mean,
I hear you, Joe, but I'm just
that's
not
going to work.
sure. I'm just not sure that we're going to be able to change it enough
Or fast enough.
Yes, that's my fear. I think it's going to change. I really do think it's going to change. The question is it going to change fast enough?
Oh yes, I agree. I don't know if it's going to be fast enough.
I think truthfully that it may have to come to something catastrophic to literally change the thinking in Washington.
It'll have to. There has to be something catastrophic, but the situation is catastrophic actually right now.
I know, Joe, but it's going to have to be. They're going to have to feel it
The
themselves.
effects are delayed.
They're going to have to feel it.
If we don't do anything right now, and we decide to do something 5 years from now or 6 years from now, it's going to be too late. Lots of damage is going to be built into the situation. Lana says, the arguments now about government spending and inflation, that's going to get worse. It's going to get worse unless we get the right people in there, because there are ways to have huge government spending and no inflation. We did it in World War II. We can do it again. But we need to change the political situation so people see if they want to survive, they're going to have to do what's necessary. Anyway, I think we're just about done, folks.
I think we are too, but it was good discussion, Joe. It was really good discussion. And thank you, everybody.
Those two, and wait till we get to the job guarantee. That's so rich. Job guarantee is so rich.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me
Very
too.
much so. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Yes, thank you, folks, and we'll see you tomorrow night. We think we'll have a bang up discussion tomorrow night. So please tell all your friends, and we will be here again tomorrow night. And we'll be here on Thursday too, by the way. On Thursday, we'll be talking about the Ohio 11th and I think the Kentucky 3rd, isn't it?
Oh, I don't even know. Maybe.
Yeah, we decided that last week. I have to check to see what it is again. But hot races that are coming up soon will be discussed on Thursday
Oh, yeah, May. The first
context
week
of
in May.
the incumbents rules.
First week
It's
in
a
May.
great discussion. Thank you, Joe and Lisa. And I love you all. We love you all.
Okay.
We love you, Kay, and we also love you all.
Love you guys. All right, I gotta go. I gotta go say goodnight to my husband.
And so do I. I mean,
No,
I don't have to
fine.
say, I don't have to say goodnight to my husband, nor
Good
do I
night, Bonnie.
nor do I have to say goodnight to Bonnie, because both Bonnie and I will be up for some time to come, since we are late birds.
Okay.
So good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night, Lisa.
Thank you, Joe.
Say goodnight to David for me.
I will. Bye-bye.